Your business is engineered for success. So when it comes to your social performance, why should it be any different? What if there was a way to open a new direct channel of communication between your business and the whole community? Voconiq uses cutting-edge engagement science methods and data science techniques to understand the voices that matter in real time. Voconiq, turning complex science-backed data into simple people-based solutions.
Welcome everybody to this panel session, which is looking at what happens after COVID in terms of our community engagement and the learnings that we've had across Australia and with some of the international engagement we've had as well. It's my pleasure, Janina Gawler. I'm here today to interview our panellists, and I'm an independent consultant specialising in community engagement, and my company is called RST Solutions. I've got the opportunity to speak with three very skilled and capable people and briefly introduce them, but basically set the context for our discussion this afternoon. So we have Florence Drummond, who's a representative from the Indigenous Women in Mining and Resources Australia, and I think you've been a founder, and for a number of years been developing opportunities for women's participation in mining and in the contracting side. John Briggs from Intract Construction, and John has had a long history working as an independent Indigenous business in the mining and construction supplies area, and has worked across Australia. And finally, Kieren Moffat from Voconiq, with a long background in working on research associated with community engagement and building trust. So welcome to you all. This is an opportunity to perhaps challenge some of our thinking. Through COVID, it's been quite challenging. I think the mining industry has been fortunate in being able to keep safety at the forefront and ensure that most of the opportunities for mining continued here in Australia. I think it's been more challenging elsewhere, and perhaps Kieren can touch on that. What I wanted to look at was that while we've seen extensive experiences where employees have been working with the mining industry, coming out of COVID, for mining companies and for the communities that are impacted or supporting mining, it's not a return to what we knew in the past. I think it's a new opportunity. There are certainly challenges, but for many communities, and certainly in Australia for Indigenous communities, remaining safe during this time was quite challenging. And so how do we ensure that we maintain an inclusive development over the next year and beyond that, so that when we come out of the COVID, we're actually seeing opportunities that perhaps may not have been possible, because now we look to local regional supply chains rather than perhaps international suppliers. So I wanted to talk a little bit about resilience, opportunities that are present in the work that you've been doing, and some examples that you can provide to listeners and participants that they might apply into their own workplace and into their relationships with communities. So I'll come to you first, Florence. If you could just give me some sort of context in which you've been working, some of the things that you've been seeing, and what you think has been both the challenges and opportunities in coming through COVID for communities and for some of the Indigenous communities, perhaps, and women that you've been working with.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Janina, for being part of this panel. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am today. So I'm home on Kurri land, up here in the Torres Strait. So definitely thank you so much for this conversation. I think it was such an excellent opportunity for us to really look now with COVID and how that's come about with us. The opportunities to improve as well. Us as IWIMRA, during COVID, we really reached out to our networks that were out there. Some of our network were grounded as well, being over the certain age and still in that operational space. So really, as you said before, safety being #1 priority in mining. So that really highlighted where our skills base is as a network. In terms of working with communities and observing what was happening with the relationship between industry and community, The MCA was definitely an amazing support in terms of information and getting things out there for both industry and community to some extent. But of course, using the channels that we usually have as well, so through the nachos and all the health channels as well. So what I observed during COVID was it was such an excellent collaboration of the systems that we have in place already, but more so identifying opportunities to improve. Our infrastructure and community is definitely something that we need to invest in further, and then you actually understanding what the needs are of the people. So infrastructure, actual practical things around storage, food storage and replenishment there, and then moving forward now with Indigenous businesses to fill the gap in terms of what's required.
I was remiss in not starting with my acknowledgement. I'm in the Bunurong community and based in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to the Kulin Nation, their leaders and emerging leaders. So John, coming to you, I think you've worked across a number of areas, and I think for communities, the isolation has been one of the challenges, and perhaps the mining industry's lack of comprehension of this challenge is one of the areas that needs to be considered going forward, because people are still very concerned about safety, and we saw a recent outbreak. Having been in Melbourne through the lockdown, it's very serious, and I think we do need to be careful. So how have you worked through this time, John, with your construction and supply industry and worked with communities?
Yeah, sure, Janina. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on the country of the Gawler people of the Adelaide Plains in South Australia, and I'm the Yorta man. And I'd also like to pay my respects to all Aboriginal people, regardless of age or where they're from. Yeah, look, from my experience, our community, we've had a couple of communities shut down that we work on, and we respect and support every single thing that they do on those communities and how they want to go about it. And how we do that is obviously communication, good communication, timely communication, and not forget where these people are and why they've shut. I think a lot of people forget the reasons why communities shut, and it's to do around the safety of the community, in particular the old people and the young, the vulnerable. And unfortunately, when they're out of sight, out of mind, people just tend to get on with what they're doing, and mine is an example of that. They're getting on protecting their mines and to protect their production rates, and I just think they forget about traditional owners and the communities that they're involved in, and they're suffering. I mean, everyone's suffering, and it's good to see the miners still going, but post-COVID, there's got to be a lot of work to be done to re-engage and build that trust.
Mm. And really the opportunity is, it's rather than seeing it as a problem, it's a significant opportunity, wouldn't you say, John? That there are people who are keen to work, they want to be back in the economic engagement, but they need some stepping stones to help them.
They do, and miners are hot and cold on engagement with traditional owners. I mean, Rio Tinto, once upon a time, leaders in this space, and everyone was followers, and unfortunately, they're not the leaders anymore, and people need to look at what's happened during COVID, and I'm pretty sure everyone will know what I'm talking about, but, I think, people really have to not use Aboriginal people just to tick a box or just because they have to. It's time to get serious and treat Aboriginal people as your partners, because that's what it is. I mean, you're on their country, you're mining their country, you have to be their partner, not just to tick a box and offer tokenism gestures to get them on board. It's deeper than that. I mean, miners have to really open their hearts and get on with it.
Thanks for that, John. And I think just looking at that opportunity, Kieren's been working on a major project looking at resilience and also associated with building trust. Certainly very interested to get your perspective on this, Kieren, because I think rather than seeing this as a challenge, it's a major opportunity for resetting the engagement that goes back to those very grassroots that John and Florence have sort of talked about.
Yeah, absolutely, Janina, and I'm in Brisbane, home of the Turrbal people, and my respects to them, past and present, their elders, and those that are emerging. So, yeah, the work that we've been doing is primarily looking at community sentiment through the period of COVID. And I apologize, I'm sitting underneath a storm at the moment. So if there's a big clap of thunder and I jump out of my chair, that's what's going on. But through this period of COVID, it's been super interesting to look at the responses of community members in places like Tom Price and Paraburdoo and Moranbah and all sorts of places. And what's been super interesting is that whilst in general concerns around COVID and related to COVID have been easing, we've seen a real large minority, sort of 25% of community members still really concerned about a few things in particular, like the isolation that COVID is bringing to their community, economics, and the impact of COVID on small business, for example, the movement of people and that sense of threat that brings. So it's important to remember that the experience of COVID as we've moved through this period is not universal, that in fact it may look and feel as though community in general is coping well, but actually the experience is very diverse at that grassroots level. That's the sort of first thing. And very significantly between communities in Australia and communities overseas, where these impacts have been incredibly visceral and remain so, where they've kind of eased and become a bit steady state here in Australia. I think the other key thing here, is that trust improved through early days of COVID. So when industry was really engaging hard and distributing resources and opening up the channels and checking in with community really effectively, we saw ratings of trust in mining companies improve on the ground. Super interesting. And what we saw is that it's because the quality of the contact improved. The irony of that, of course, is that was because face-to-face contact was abandoned. We weren't able to do that. And so that meant that community practitioners were picking up the phone and calling people and having meaningful, authentic conversations about what was going on for them in their lives right then, and thinking about how the company could align itself. So when we think about that in the context of resilience, community resilience, there's a multitude of factors that underpin resilience, and communities have worked well into a range of them, including protecting the health of communities, distributing economic resources equitably and liberally, and communicating effectively into that world of uncertainty. But more than that, they are important sources of economic continuity and reassurance. Communities saw them differently, or perhaps the way things could be were revealed more clearly. And I think that's a key lesson for industry to reflect on, is what does industry want these relationships to look like, to be, and to produce? And as John has said there, what does partnership mean? If that's how we talk about this, then let's take this opportunity to take a step back and think about the principles of a partnership and how to realise them.
I think you make a really important point there, both on the opportunities of partnerships, but certainly during the early days, when you think through the impact of COVID in local communities, the mining industry generally was very proactive. It recognised that keeping both their employees safe, but their networks safe was important. And so, yes, there might not have been that face-to-face contact, but there was certainly a lot of engagement. And it's interesting that that's reflected in heightened trust because the companies were able to distribute PPE, for example. They were able to work to support access to some locations, appreciating that people were in remote locations. And again, because mining has access to resources and to physical resources and construction vehicles, for example, that can get out to places that otherwise might not be accessible. So I think that that's something to take forward as a strong learning. John, you talked about sort of the building of the partnership when we were having a chat earlier before we started the session, the sort of steps to follow and making sure that you keep going back. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the experiences you've seen where traditional owners are well engaged in that conversation?
Well, it's got to be engagement from the get-go, and it's got to be treating people with respect and making them feel wanted and feel a part of what's going on their country. I mean, if people take that more seriously, I think they would have better outcomes in the long run. I think that that some mines tend to do things as a cost-saving exercise, but I think we've all seen in the long run that if you have better engagement, and you have better trust, and you build better capabilities around your people and your traditional owners, the rewards are going to come, and you're not going to get the problems that you get with some of the cultural heritage issues that have gone around on some of the mines and the devastating effects that has to their bottom line. So I think everyone needs to think about that and think about the implications of what they're doing and how they're doing it, and build the trust and get the community involved and make them feel part of it in that partnership. And I think that's so important, Janina. I mean, you know, I've seen that in the 90s in Tom Price and Paraburdoo and right through the Pilbara with what you and your team at Rio Tinto done. And that worked. I mean, what happened recently wouldn't have happened back in those days. And, you know, it's a shame we've gone away from that. And I think the dollar drives it. And I think all the expertise from a lot of mines is gone. People have moved on. And young people are coming into those roles now that really have no idea on engagement. And it's probably through no fault of their own. You know, I think, you know, there needs to be more education around the internal people of the mines as well, for the better understanding of what being Aboriginal is, what being a traditional owner is, what mining on their country means to those people. And I think that they really, really need to get serious about it.
And I think there are some guidances that we've seen now come out. I mean, there's been learnings, and obviously the first learning comes from working with people on their country to understand the fundamentals of both the history, the culture, the heritage. But we've seen, while there've been changes in industry capability, we're also starting to see some more guidance that's come out. And I think, Florence, you mentioned yesterday there's a new guidance out specifically on Indigenous business, but you've also been working on supply nations. So it might be useful to talk a little about those areas, because that's part of helping to build the economic base for continuing engagement, both with the mining industry and elsewhere.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So the other day, the Australian Guide to Business in reflection of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People was released. That's an excellent guide, and I think that's with us, with IWIMRA moving forward, that we'll be using that in terms of our guidance. And then not working directly with Supply Nation, but just observing the increase of Indigenous consultants in the space as well. I think there's so much opportunity there for that cultural exchange. We've partnered with a few people around the space to deliver these. But what we're really trying to do with IWIMRA is, you know, we are women from the industry. We know what it's like to be on the ground. So we're really trying to create that experience for us where, you know, we are transitioning into a more automated space. So we're making sure that if there's consultancy opportunities there for our network, that we can be most informed. Yes, most of us aren't traditional owners, but we've been the product of the industry. We can really speak on that behalf from that experience. And I think we could really help these internal teams on how to best engage with Indigenous people. So those are definitely some of the things that we're aiming for in terms of IWIMRA. And I think that's a really healthy balance there in terms of supply and demand. You know, people are phasing out of their roles. Where are they going into? Are they going into businesses? Can they be consultants to the industry? How can we utilize all that skills base that's been built on for so long? And
one area you mentioned when we were talking was in the Supply Nation area, understanding what makes up an Indigenous business, that there's a responsibility to have a due diligence around that on the part of the partners, for example, and to make sure that the intention and capability is built in. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So there is a growing appetite for more knowledge around Indigenous engagement and team dynamics. In the consultancy spaces, we're really thinking about who you're engaging with in terms of, are they 100% owned and operated Indigenous business, or do they meet the requirements that where they're not black-cladded? I know a lot of Indigenous businesses do not suffer but struggle to compete with these businesses as well. So I think that's something that we should definitely still be shedding the light on behalf of entrepreneurs in the mining industry, but also across industries as well. That's definitely something that we should be mindful of.
And I think that the investment, as you've all mentioned, actually redoubles the return, if you like, so that it's not seen to be a cost, it's an opportunity for that investment. And Kieren, I think some of your recent learnings in this area are very interesting, if you'd like to share those particularly.
Yeah, sure. And it's a really great point in investing. And it kind of has really two parts, doesn't it? You're investing in capability to deliver service to a company, but you're also investing in relationship. You're investing in your commitment to that place and to those people connected to it, and you know, to Aboriginal businesses. I think that's, yeah, there's multiple benefits in those kinds of relationships when they're done well.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, in this piece of work that we'll be publishing shortly with ICMM on community resilience, we looked at where companies typically invest their energy and resources now. And what we found was that it's really focused on their core business, you know, shocker, but, you know, economic vitality and local spend, health of community and workforce, local engagement, and preparedness for shocks and change, and supporting institutions because they're critical through difficult periods like the one we're in now. And these are all reasonable and sensible areas, and companies have been doing that for a long time, which I think then begs the logical question that if that's where industry have been investing their energy for a long time, and yet we still have deep levels of dependency, we still have deep levels of brittleness, I think, in communities that are revealed when shocks come, when periods of turbulence come, then maybe it's worth looking at other areas. And so if we looked at the other areas where industry doesn't invest too much into the resiliency factors that are important in this space, we see that you know, there are other less obvious, maybe less comfortable factors that they could be, you know, investing in, like developing social networks,
Mm-hmm.
the communication capacity and infrastructure within communities, and also organisation and leadership capacity. And so investing in those capacities are uncomfortable and novel because they're not core business. They're not the levers of their engines as they're used to, but they're ways of stepping in to step out, if you like, to get in and build the capacity of communities to help them be less dependent, and to chart their own future. So, you know, for me, you know, the key one, or I guess the one that jumps out at me there's a really obvious example, which is organisation and leadership. So we see lots of community-based groups in remote and regional Australia. They are the lifeblood of these communities, and people from companies hold many of the same leadership roles in lots of these companies, and a change comes to the industry, and those people might leave and lots of groups fall over almost overnight. And so a new model of leadership is required, I think, for regional remote Australia that distributes the responsibilities within those roles across more than just one or two people. And what's really interesting when you think about mining companies is that they're effectively leadership factories, that they spend a lot of energy and resources on building the capacity of people within those companies to lead effectively within very well-structured environments. And I think that sort of capacity and that turning of that table to think about not what we're good at as a company and what do we invest in the community that looks just like that, but what does community need to be less dependent on us and to be more resilient in the face of change, to take advantage of that turbulence and opportunity, as well as to weather the storm, and to leverage our strengths in new and novel ways. So, you know, that's kind of where our thinking has been going, and where I think there's quite a bit of opportunity, actually.
So it's sort of almost counterintuitive that the stepping in to step out is breaking that paternalistic sense of we've got a partnership based on what I give you, rather than let's work together so that you can become independent. And yes, you might well become quite robust in that independence, but that's part of building resilience, that we have strong partnerships that can actually flex during these times. So I thought if you had a takeout, that what are your takeouts in this area, Kieren, for listeners?
Yeah, look, I think the idea of being able to invest in the creative capacity of communities to find ways to manage their own challenges with and independent of mining, utilizing the resources of mining as a stepping stone rather than as a millstone. That would be my takeaway. That, in fact, industry shouldn't be looking to reduce conflict and the contest and reduce friction with communities, but actually to have constructive ways of resolving that conflict and actually be using conflict as a resource. It tells you what's important, what's meaningful, what stake people are defending. And so building relationships built on trust means building relationships that can manage difficult times and conflict, and to do that constructively. That would be my takeaway.
Right. And Florence, your take out?
I'd definitely be focused on language, as opposed, like language in the sense that we all need to understand how we talk about the industry, how we talk about these relationships and partnerships. That's so important to firstly even describe, the environment of the relationship, the character of it. So really not thinking about this is what you need, you're dependent, thinking, what's the opportunities to improve. I think language for me is my biggest takeaway and something that we'll be actively working on.
And John, yours, I think, building trust from the ground up. What do you think are the key messages for people?
One of the big ones, I think, is if you're going to have a reconciliation action plan, which all these miners have, don't just sit them in the foyer of head office. Actually take them seriously, put them up the top, put them above safety, and have a structure of a reconciliation action plan that's actually meaningful. And as was said before, make that so that if people do leave, what's the structure of people leaving? How serious do you want to take it? Maybe do a questionnaire with your shareholders to see how they want to see their traditional owners treated on the money that they're making from the mines. I mean, they've got to go back and see what actually everyone wants and get everyone on board and make that reconciliation action plan one of the best documents that you have, so that when you leave and the legacy of what you have, you're leaving all sorts of legacies around what Florence said around infrastructure and all of those things that communities need. But, we also need a legacy of fantastic education, because at the end of the day, education is a key out of poverty. And I'd like to see that in all the reconciliation action plans as well.
Yeah, and I think one of your comments was to open your mind and to open your heart.
Open your mind, open your heart, and get outside of that square.
And I think that's an opportunity that COVID's provided us with to disrupt our thinking and to embrace new pathways that will build a stronger future for everybody in the regional communities that support and are impacted by mining, but also for mining companies themselves to see their future that's linked with those partnerships. So thank you all very much for the inputs. It's been a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Your business is engineered for success. So when it comes to your social performance, why should it be any different? What if there was a way to open a new direct channel of communication between your business and the whole community? Voconiq uses cutting-edge engagement science methods and data science techniques to understand the voices that matter in real time. Voconiq, turning complex science-backed data into simple people-based solutions.